Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining me this month as we cover the Rocky Mountain ADA Center's most commonly asked TAs in December. Since we usually do a live webinar on the last Friday of the month, this webinar has been pre-recorded just so our families can hang stockings by the chimney with care. My name is Jenny DeVries, and I am the training facilitator at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. And no matter how you celebrate the holidays, I want to say thank you for joining. Let's get started. For maximum accessibility, I will be reading off these slides word for word and adding in any subsequent information at the end of each slide. So the information, materials, and/or technical assistance are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the ADA, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility under the ADA. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center is operated by Meeting the Challenge, and we're funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, also known as NIDLR. And it's there to provide technical assistance, training, and materials to Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming on the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are one of 10 regional ADA centers. The Rocky Mountain Center serves Region 8. So to reach our center, all you have to do is call that number you see on the screen, 1-800-949-4232. That's the number you'll call for any kind of technical assistance, or TA as we like to call it. So TA is a large part of what we do. We help interpret the ADA for government officials, employers, small businesses, etc. We're here to answer any tricky questions that you might have. For networking, we also have access to important entities within the ADA like the Department of Justice and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and we can refer people to our contacts within the network. For conducting research, part of our grant funding requires we do research. For instance, we're doing a fascinating study on how implicit bias affects people with disabilities. For training, which is what we're doing now, we do offer training on all aspects of the ADA, from disability etiquette to service animals to government's responsibilities under the ADA. We also publish a wide variety of online trainings, as well as create blog posts addressing different aspects of the ADA. And finally, with social media, we do have a very strong presence there. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Pinterest. Our learning objectives today are to discuss the most common calls, emails, and online requests from those in Region 8. We will review common questions about employment, program access for Title II, and effective communication, just to name a few. And we will provide resources to those TAs. If you would like to send in a question, my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. Some questions or concerns may not arise until later after you've digested the material. So please know that this is just the first step in our learning journey, and we're happy to talk with you more outside of this webinar. Now, before we dive into the most common questions this month, I'd like to review Titles 1, 2, and 3 of the ADA, as well as address the other common topics that we received. So Title I prohibits private employers, state and local governments, employment agencies, and labor unions from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities in job application procedures, hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, job training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. Employers must provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities when necessary to complete the essential functions of the job. This month, we'll be specifically addressing reasonable accommodations. Now, for Title II, this applies to state and local government entities, and it protects qualified individuals with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of their disability in the services, programs, and activities that are provided by state and local government entities. Today, we will cover facility access and program access. And also this month, we have seen a lot of crossover between Titles 2 and 3. So Title III prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in activities of places of public accommodations. These are generally just businesses open to the public, like restaurants, movie theaters, schools, daycare facilities, recreation facilities, and doctor's offices. So these public accommodations have to reasonably modify their policies, practices, and procedures to accommodate people with disabilities. Also falling under the ADA and our most commonly asked questions this month are effective communication, service animals, and other laws that affect people with disabilities, including the Fair Housing Act and Section 504. All right, so first scenario we'll dive into. Rudolph the reindeer has recently developed anxiety from the stress of this year, and who can't relate to that? He has requested a reasonable accommodation, but the stable manager told Rudolph he can't provide the RA. Now the manager is telling Rudolph he won't be leading Santa's sleigh this year, leading Rudolph to believe he is being retaliated against for requesting an accommodation. Now, under the ADA, the law requires an employer to provide reasonable accommodation to an employee or job applicant with a disability, unless doing so would cause significant difficulty or expense for the employer. This is also known as undue hardship. So in this case, it does seem like Rudolph's stable manager is now taking it a step further and discriminating against Rudolph for advocating for his rights under the ADA, which is prohibited. So if Rudolph feels like he's been discriminated against, he will need to contact the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This charge generally must be filed within 180 days of the alleged discrimination. If there is, however, a state or local law that provides relief for discrimination, it may be extended to 300 days. But regardless, it is best to contact the EEOC promptly. So, a reindeer new to Santa's sleigh team, Jackson, is still in training. His handler would like to take Jackson into her workplace, but her employer is hesitant. Service animals in training are tricky. They are not covered under the ADA. So, under the ADA, only employees with disabilities are entitled to reasonable accommodations. So if an employee without a disability is training a service animal for someone else, there's not going to be an accommodation obligation under the ADA. For employees with disabilities, an employer may have a valid concern about the potential disruption of a service animal in training that it might create. So they may not have to allow the employee to bring in the service animal until it is fully trained, or at least until it can be in the workplace without disruption. And some states have laws addressing access for service animals in training, so employers should check with their state laws to make sure. There are a number of resources we gave out this month related to Title I questions. The first is knowing where to file a complaint. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's phone number is 800-669-4000. Disability Law Colorado is 303-722-0300. And Colorado Civil Rights Division can be reached at 719-545-3520. Obviously, these are Colorado specific resources. So if you are outside of Colorado, just give us a ring and we can get one specific to your state. And as we can all tell, service animals are tricky. And as usual, the Job Accommodation Network is a great resource. They have a whole resource page on service animals in the workplace. And you should also consider looking into Jan's Q&A document, what does reasonable mean, to better understand how employers should make their decisions when accommodating an employee with a disability. For Title II, we're covering both program access and the standards. So instead of making city sidewalks with cement, the North Pole is proposing using an enhanced thermoplastic pattern. Now, some things to consider when using materials in city construction are: one, the surface material, whether it's stable, firm, and slip resistant throughout all weather conditions, and will this include rain or snow? The second is, what does maintenance of the material look like over time? So is it susceptible to damage from snow plows? Does the city have a plan that can quickly repair this material when necessary? And something else to consider is if repairs will require a professional, because if so, it will likely cause longer repair times that will impact specifically people with disabilities. Of course, temporary interruptions due to maintenance are permitted by the ADA, but the city should perform due diligence by ensuring they understand how to execute the repair process prior to any closure for repair to avoid interruptions that last longer than necessary. The next scenario is at a retirement home. Certain elves are more independent than others. Papa Elf has said in case of emergencies, they are responsible for their own evacuation. Papa Elf has said that the center would ensure safety, but that they are not liable. So, if the senior community falls under the ADA, then there should not be a policy that discriminates against people with known disabilities. It is possible, given the nature of the facility, that the ADA applies, but it is hard to tell, particularly because depending on its structure and funding, it could qualify, and it could qualify as a Title I or a Title III entity. So, just in general, an organization would have to be very careful about not discriminating against people with disabilities, nor making policies that put them at risk, especially in case of emergencies. Resources for our Title II questions are, per usual, the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. And with regards to the emergency planning section, a helpful place to start comes from the ADA website, ada.gov. And finally, know your local ADA coordinator. And we can find access to these resources for you if you give us a call or email. Now, Title III. While revising the entrance to their business, Gingerbread & Co. wonders if edge protection is required on ramps less than 6 inches high or shorter than 6 feet long. So as a reminder, the 2010 standards for accessible design apply to both Title II and Title III entities. And in this case, no, edge protection is only going to be required when the rise is greater than 6 inches or longer than 6 feet. Gingerbread & Co. has a live work facility, and the front room is intended as the commercial facility. They wonder if that unit's bathroom must comply. What about public restrooms? And can the restrooms be common area restrooms used by all live work units, regardless of if they're in the same building or a different one? So commercial facilities are a unique aspect of the 2010 standards, and even from this question, obviously get complicated quickly. So the restroom should be accessible if it's accessed by employees and it falls under new construction. But if not, the restroom access should be addressed by other readily achievable barrier removal and or reasonable accommodations under Title I of the ADA if or when needed. So with the other question, are public restrooms required at the property? So building code may or may not address this aspect, but the ADA does not require restrooms, only that if the restrooms are provided, that they are accessible. With the next question, can the restrooms be common area restrooms used by all live work units if they're in this, regardless of if they're in the same building or in a different one? So again, if there were an entity that addresses this, it should be the building code. And the ADA aspect of this question wouldn't really address Gingerbread & Co.'s specific question, but if it was in a different building or area, then it too should be connected via an accessible route. For Title III resources, as a reminder, Title III entities have the general requirements of maintenance of accessible features and to remove barriers in case of alterations or new construction while also following local building codes. If you're unsure of your responsibilities under the ADA, whether within physical barriers or metaphorical ones within your policies or procedures that discriminate against a customer trying to access goods and services, we suggest you look into the ADA and small business hyperlinked here. Other ones to stay in mind are those Title III regulations. We did get a number of important questions about effective communication, particularly from or for deaf individuals. As a reminder, people who have vision, hearing, or speech disabilities, known as communication disabilities, use different ways to communicate. For example, people who are blind may give and receive information audibly rather than in writing, and people who are deaf may give and receive information through writing or sign language rather than through speech. So the ADA requires that Title II entities, which are state and local governments, and Title III entities, which are businesses and nonprofit organizations that serve the public, communicate effectively with people who have communication disabilities. And the goal is to ensure that communication with people with these disabilities is equally as effective as communication with people without disabilities. So with this first scenario, disaster strikes when lighting the final candle of the menorah, Sarah sets off the fire alarm. First responders are called, but there is no interpreter to interview her. In this case, Sarah should consider reaching out to her local ADA coordinator to resolve this problem. In the second scenario, during a doctor's visit, Jack Frost, who is hard of hearing, requests an interpreter. After receiving the bill, Jack notices that the office charged him for interpreting fees. Now, the key to deciding what aid or service is needed to communicate effectively is to consider the nature, length, complexity, and context of the communication, as well as that person's preferred method of communication. So other solutions may be needed where the information being communicated is more extensive or complex. Like in this doctor's office example, an interpreter generally will be needed for taking the medical history of a patient who uses sign language or for discussing a serious diagnosis and its treatment options. However, the Title III entity may not place a surcharge on interpreting fees like they did in this situation. So the ADA website has excellent resources on examples of effective communication, as well as information on the differing responsibilities of Title II and III entities. DOVE, or the Deaf Overcoming Violence Through Empowerment, is located in Denver. They have a 24-hour video phone hotline at 303-831-7874, or you can email them. And finally, the Colorado School for the Deaf and the Blind could also be a useful resource. Other common TAs we received were about the Fair Housing Act, masks, and Section 504. The Fair Housing Act applies to, of course, housing, which is outside the purview of the ADA. And someone asked if their landlord can request documentation of a service animal as a prerequisite to allowing the handler to live in the complex. So the ADA covers places of public accommodation in state and local governments, as well as employment, but the FHA is what covers housing. So we do get a lot of housing related questions. Unfortunately, we just can't speak to them with any authority. So the next common question was about masks, which is very common, especially in this day and age. This time, a hotel has made it policy to require people to wear face masks during check-in. So reasonable modifications should be discussed, but it's possibly within the hotel's right to require a mask at this time because of a safety threat. And the state of Colorado provides guidance on the state mandatory mask requirements and when someone may not be required to wear one. So this includes people who are 10 years old and younger, or people who can't medically tolerate a face covering. And finally, an issue with the post office. So the post office's new hours force me to wait in line, which affects my disability. Now, this is unfortunate, but the post office is a federal agency that is covered by the Rehabilitation Act, which is Section 504. And the ADA applies to state and local governments, so we can't answer in specifics, but we do have referrals if needed. Now, we did cover a lot of resources with that catch-all of all of these TAs. So the first and most common referral we make is to local independent living centers. And with regards to the Section 504 question, both the U.S. Attorney's Office and U.S. DOJ Colorado office number is 303 454-0100. Fair Housing First is another common referral, and this is often when we get those Fair Housing Act questions. We suggest people call their number, which is 888-241-7781. And of course, we're always here to help. You can reach us at 800-949-4232. And that wraps it up for me, and that's a wrap on 2020. So thank you all again for joining me today or whenever you decided to tune in. We offer this month in TAs on the last Friday of every month. So keep an eye out for 2021 January's webinar. Again, my name is Jenny DeVries, and on behalf of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, we hope you all have a safe and healthy holiday.